January 26, 1945, Holtzwihr, France. A German soldier from the 2nd Mountain Division watched through the aid station window as medics carried in the wounded. His unit had just attacked with 250 men and 6 tanks against one American lieutenant standing on a burning tank destroyer. The American had 1 machine gun. Within an hour, the German force was reduced to 70 effective soldiers. The survivors could speak of nothing but the weapon that had stopped them cold. The weapon was not a secret wonder weapon, not a technological marvel born in German laboratories, but a simple American machine gun that had first rolled off production lines in 1933. Yet, this weapon, the Browning M2.50 caliber heavy machine gun, would become the most feared piece of equipment in the American arsenal. Not because of its complexity, but because of its brutal, relentless effectiveness. The German survivors had just witnessed what would become one of the most legendary engagements in American military history. First Lieutenant Audie Murphy, wounded and alone, had climbed aboard a burning M10 tank destroyer and turned its turret-mounted .50 caliber machine gun on an entire German infantry company supported by armor. For over an hour, Murphy fired the weapon with such devastating effect that the German attack simply disintegrated. The official Medal of Honor citation awarded by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch on June 2, 1945, confirmed that Murphy inflicted approximately 50 casualties on the attacking force. The wounds caused by .50 caliber impacts became grimly familiar to German medical personnel. Unlike rifle rounds that might wound and allow recovery, .50 caliber projectiles caused catastrophic tissue damage. The massive kinetic energy transfer meant that a hit to a limb often resulted in amputation. A hit to the torso was almost invariably fatal. German field hospitals near the front learned to recognize .50 caliber casualties by the nature of their wounds. There was little that medical personnel could do except provide comfort and attempt to stabilize patients for evacuation. Many wounded never reached field hospitals. The medical impact extended beyond direct casualties. German units that came under sustained .50 caliber fire suffered psychological casualties, combat exhaustion, and breakdown of unit cohesion at rates higher than units that faced conventional small arms fire. Medical officers noted that soldiers who had been subjected to repeated .50 caliber attacks, even when not physically wounded, showed signs of severe stress and combat fatigue. The knowledge that the next burst of fire could not be survived by taking cover. That luck rather than skill-determined survival created a sense of helplessness that was medically and militarily significant, but the Holtzwihr action was not an isolated incident. From the bocage of Normandy to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, from the deserts of North Africa to the skies over the Reich itself, German soldiers learned to recognize and fear a distinctive sound. The deep rhythmic thunder of the M2 Browning, firing between 450 and 575 rounds per minute. Each massive .50 caliber round carrying enough energy to punch through light armor, tear through concrete, and turn human bodies into unrecognizable wreckage. The transformation from skepticism to terror had begun 3 years earlier. The mathematics of American industrial might were about to be written not in production statistics, but in the experience of German soldiers who faced this weapon and survived to tell about it. What they discovered would shatter their understanding of modern warfare and reveal a profound truth about American military doctrine. The United States had not built the most sophisticated heavy machine gun. They had built something far more dangerous. They had built the most reliable, most ubiquitous, and most psychologically devastating crew-served weapon in history. The hatred began not with fear, but with contempt. September 6, 1943. The skies over Stuttgart. 388 B-17 flying fortresses approached Germany's industrial heartland in the first major daylight raid on the city. Luftwaffe fighter units scrambled to intercept. Among them were veterans who had shot down dozens of Allied aircraft over 2 years of combat. They were confident in their Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft, each armed with 4 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The German pilots rolled into their attack runs from high and ahead, standard doctrine for intercepting the American heavies. At 800 meters, they opened fire. Cannons thundered, shells streaking toward the lead bombers. Then something happened that would change German understanding of air combat forever. The bombers erupted with fire. Not the smoke of damaged aircraft, but muzzle flashes. Each B-17 carried 13 Browning M2 machine guns. A typical formation of 36 bombers meant for 168 heavy machine guns, all firing the same .50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge that could reach out to 1,830 meters with lethal effect. The combined defensive firepower of the formation exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute, creating a wall of steel that no fighter could safely penetrate. German fighters felt their aircraft shudder as .50 caliber rounds tore into wings, engine cowlings, and canopies. They broke off attacks, diving away with aircraft trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid. The raid cost the Luftwaffe heavily. 45 B-17s were lost. But German fighter losses were catastrophic for units that could no longer replace experienced pilots. What the German pilots did not yet understand was that they were encountering not just a weapon, but a philosophy of warfare. The Americans had solved the problem of bomber defense not through technological sophistication, but through overwhelming volume of fire. Each B-17G carried between 5,000 and 7,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, distributed across 13 gun positions with some crews adding extra ammunition beyond regulations. Luftwaffe pilots had been trained to respect 20mm and 30mm cannons because those weapons could destroy a bomber with a single well-placed shot. They had learned to fear the explosive rounds that would detonate on contact, but the American .50 caliber did not explode. It did not need to. The massive half-inch diameter projectile, weighing 707 grains, traveling at 2,900 feet per second, carrying 12,000 feet lb of muzzle energy, simply punched holes in everything it touched. Wings, engines, fuel tanks, pilots. By October 1943, Luftwaffe fighter units had begun to understand the true danger. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wormhille, an ace with 93 victories, described the American bomber formations in a letter to his family. To attack the Americans is to fly through a storm of steel. You see the tracers 1 round in 5, and you know that for every tracer you see, for more bullets you cannot see are flying past. When you close to effective cannon range, you are already inside their killing zone. The Germans adapted their tactics. They tried head-on attacks, diving from above, climbing from below, attacking from the sides. Nothing worked consistently. The American gunners had overlapping fields of fire. If you came from ahead, the nose guns and top turret would engage. From behind, the tail guns and bull turret. From the sides, the waist guns. From above or below, the bull turret and top turret. There was no safe approach. The United States Army Air Forces had arranged their combat box formations of 1-8-1. Aircraft in three-dimensional space specifically to maximize overlapping fields of defensive fire, but the real horror was not the volume of fire, it was the reliability. German pilots flying the Me-109 or FW-190 knew that their cannons were prone to jamming, especially in the cold air at high altitude. The German NG-130 113mm machine gun was better, but it still required careful maintenance and would fail at critical moments. The American Browning M2, by contrast, simply worked. It fired continuously for hours. It operated in temperatures ranging from -$40 circ dollar to $40 circ mathrm C dollar. It functioned after being hit by German cannon fire. It kept shooting even when the barrels glowed red from sustained fire. American maintenance crews would replace overheated barrels in minutes, not hours, and the gun would resume firing without missing a beat. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, a Ru-88 pilot who flew bomber intercept missions over the Reich, survived the war to give testimony at the post-war Luftwaffe debriefings. His words, recorded in March 1946, captured the growing realization among German air crew. We called the American bomber formations Die Fliegenden Festung and the Flying Fortresses. But what made them true fortresses was not their armor or their formation discipline. It was those .50 caliber machine guns that never stopped firing, never jammed, never gave us an opening. We lost so many pilots, not to American fighters, but to the bomber defensive fire. It was like flying into a meat grinder. The ground war told the same story with different details. June 6, 1944, Normandy. Oberst Hans von Luck commanded elements of the 21st Panzer Division defending against the Allied invasion. Von Luck was no ordinary officer. He had fought at El Alamein, earned the Knight's Cross, and would later publish his acclaimed memoir, Panzer Commander. His division was among the first German units to encounter American forces in sustained ground combat. What von Luck discovered was that American doctrine had placed the .50 caliber machine gun on virtually every combat vehicle. Jeeps mounted them, trucks mounted them, half-tracks mounted them, tanks mounted them on turret roofs, tank destroyers mounted them, even supply vehicles carried them for convoy protection. The Americans had achieved something the Germans had never attempted: universal heavy machine gun coverage across their entire force structure. Von Luck wrote in his memoir about the tactical implications. We had been told our training and our tactical doctrine would overcome American material advantage. At Normandy, I learned the truth. The Americans did not need superior tactics. They had enough ammunition to make mistakes and still win. Their .50 caliber machine guns were on every vehicle, every position, firing continuously. We could not move in daylight. Any attempt to maneuver drew immediate and overwhelming fire. The psychological effect was as destructive as the physical casualties. The German army had built its infantry doctrine around the machine gun. The MG-34 and its successor, the MG-42, were excellent weapons. The MG-40 fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, earning the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw from Allied soldiers who heard its distinctive sound. German squads carried 1,800 rounds per machine gun and organized their tactics around supporting the gun crew. The concept called Einheitsmaschinengewehr, or general purpose machine gun, would later be adopted by NATO forces because it was tactically sound, but the Germans had never imagined the scale of American .50 caliber employment. A single American armored division advancing through France would have hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns mounted on vehicles. American supply convoys used a documented pattern of alternating fire. One vehicle shooting right, the next shooting left to cover both flanks and break up German ambushes. This tactic was specifically effective against Panzerfaust teams trying to engage American armor at close range. American armored columns employed what they called reconnaissance by fire. Rather than carefully advancing and waiting for the enemy to reveal positions, American units would fire their .50 caliber machine guns continuously into any suspicious location. Tree lines, farm buildings, stone walls, hedgerows. The volume of fire would either suppress hidden German positions or provoke return fire that revealed their locations. This tactic, documented extensively in primary sources including Tank Tactics from Normandy to Lorraine by Roman Yaremovich, drove German soldiers to distraction. German infantry veterans of the Eastern Front thought they had experienced the worst of industrial warfare against the Soviets. Then they encountered American firepower doctrine in France. German squad leaders who survived the fighting in Normandy and were taken prisoner described the difference in their debriefings preserved in the United States Army Historical Division files. Against the Russians, we faced human wave attacks and artillery barrages. Against the Americans, we faced machine gun fire that never stopped. They fired at everything. They fired at nothing. They fired to make us keep our heads down. They fired to prevent us from moving. They fired because they had unlimited ammunition and we did not. After 2 weeks fighting the Americans in the bocage, soldiers would not leave cover during daylight. It was not cowardice. It was mathematics. Movement meant death. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage demonstrated American firepower philosophy at its most extreme. This was a half-track mounting 4.50 caliber machine guns in a powered turret originally designed for anti-aircraft defense. The combined rate of fire approached 2,200 rounds per minute. American soldiers called it the meat chopper or the kraut mower. Official reports from the 473rd AA Battalion in November 1944 stated that the primary mission of the M16 half-track anti-aircraft often became its secondary mission, and it was used instead against ground troops. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had been largely defeated over Western Europe. American anti-aircraft units found themselves repurposed for ground support operations. The M16 proved devastatingly effective against German infantry and light vehicles. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces made their last major offensive in the West from December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, M16 units were credited with breaking up numerous German infantry attacks simply by traversing their four-gun mounts across attacking formations. The experience of German forces attempting to ambush American supply convoys illustrates why the .50 caliber became so hated. German doctrine for convoy ambush called for allowing the lead vehicles to pass, then destroying vehicles in the middle of the column to create a roadblock, then systematically destroying the trapped convoy. This tactic had worked effectively against British and Soviet supply lines earlier in the war. Against American convoys, the tactic failed catastrophically. American convoy doctrine placed .50 caliber armed vehicles at intervals throughout the column. When an ambush was initiated, American vehicles would immediately return fire with their .50 calibers, while other vehicles maneuvered to flank the ambush position. The volume of return fire was so intense that German ambush teams frequently suffered heavier casualties than the convoys they attacked. German platoon leaders who participated in convoy ambushes during the fighting in France described the evolution of German tactics and their ultimate failure in post-war interrogations. In early ambushes, German forces positioned infantry with machine guns and Panzer along roads. American convoys had vehicles equipped with .50 caliber machine guns distributed throughout. The volume of return fire from the convoys was devastating. German units learned to only ambush isolated vehicles. Never convoys, but isolated vehicles were rare. The Americans moved in strength precisely because they knew German forces could not effectively attack their convoys. The pattern of alternating fire that American convoys employed was particularly effective. Vehicles on the right side of the road would fire into the right flank. Vehicles on the left would fire left. This created intersecting fields of fire that covered both sides of the road simultaneously. German forces attempting to ambush from one side would find themselves under fire, not only from that side of the convoy, but from the opposite side as well. The psychological effect of being under fire from multiple directions by weapons that could penetrate cover and had seemingly unlimited ammunition made successful ambushes nearly impossible. American logistics units understood that the .50 caliber machine gun was their primary defense. Drivers and assistant drivers received training on the weapons. Ammunition was loaded in quantities far exceeding official allocations. Convoy commanders were authorized to engage any suspected threat with immediate and overwhelming fire. The result was that German forces, by mid to late 1944, had largely given up, attempting to interdict American supply lines in areas where American forces had air superiority and sufficient ground combat power to respond to attacks. This had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. German forces in France and later in Germany itself could not effectively interrupt American logistics. American units could count on regular resupply of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment. This meant American tactical planning could assume that firepower would be available when needed. German planning, by contrast, had to account for chronic ammunition shortages, fuel shortages, and the certainty that whatever supplies did arrive would arrive late and in insufficient quantities. The .50 caliber machine gun was both a cause and a symptom of American logistical superiority. It was effective because American industry could produce ammunition in vast quantities. It enabled continued operations because its reliability meant that ammunition once delivered would be effectively employed. German soldiers watching American tracer fire arc across the battlefield at night understood they were seeing not just ammunition expenditure, but the visible proof of an industrial capacity. They could not match. The terror from the air added another dimension to German fear of the .50 caliber. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which American pilots nicknamed the Jug, carried 8 Browning M2 machine guns in its wings. This meant a single fighter could deliver 4,400 rounds per minute of combined firepower during strafing runs. German ground forces learned to recognize the distinctive shape of the P-47 and the sound that preceded death. A strafing run by a flight of 4 P-47s meant 32.50 caliber machine guns converging on a target area. The aircraft would approach at high speed and low altitude, often with minimal warning. Pilots would open fire at ranges of 600 to 800 meters and walk their fire across German positions, vehicles, and troop concentrations. The effect was described by survivors as a horizontal rainstorm of metal that left nothing intact. German supply sergeants who survived multiple strafing attacks during the retreat from Normandy in August 1940 described the helplessness German ground troops felt against American air power in their interrogations. You hear the engines first. By the time you look up, they are already firing. The bullets hit the road, the vehicles, the men, all at once. There is no cover that works. Stone walls crumble. Trees are cut down. Metal tears like paper. You can be behind a truck one moment and the truck is gone the next, just pieces of metal and fire. Soldiers learn to abandon vehicles the moment they heard aircraft engines. Better to lose the vehicle than the vehicle and the crew. The P-47 proved particularly effective in what American pilots called armed reconnaissance missions. Rather than targeting specific objectives, flights would patrol assigned sectors looking for targets of opportunity. Any German vehicle moving during daylight risked attack, any troop column, any supply convoy, any artillery position. The 8.50 caliber machine guns gave pilots enough ammunition to engage multiple targets during a single sortie. A pilot might strafe a convoy, climb to altitude, spot a German tank platoon, dive to attack them, then strafe a crossroads on the return flight. The ammunition capacity, approximately 425 rounds per gun, meant 3,400 rounds total, enough for sustained combat. German forces adapted by moving primarily at night and in bad weather. But this adaptation came at enormous cost to operational tempo and logistics. Supplies that should have taken hours to move required days. Reinforcements arrived late or not at all. The Luftwaffe's inability to contest American air superiority by mid-1944 meant that German ground forces operated under constant threat of air attack. And the primary weapon delivering that threat was the .50 caliber machine gun. The combination of ground-mounted and air-delivered .50 caliber fire created a comprehensive suppression effect. German units could not move safely in daylight because of strafing attacks. They could not move safely at night because American ground forces used reconnaissance by fire with vehicle-mounted .50 calibers to interdict roads and trails. They could not concentrate forces for counterattacks because American doctrine called for immediate engagement of any identified German formation with all available firepower, including .50 caliber machine guns that could fire continuously while other weapons were being brought to bear. This was the reality that broke German combat effectiveness in the West, not a single decisive battle, not a wonder weapon, but the cumulative weight of facing an opponent whose basic heavy machine gun was present in such overwhelming quantities and employed so lavishly that traditional military responses became irrelevant. German tactical doctrine, German training, German fighting spirit. None of these factors could overcome the simple mathematical reality that American forces could deliver superior firepower to any point on the battlefield faster than German forces could respond. A German infantry battalion attacking an American position might face 50 to 100.50 caliber machine guns, all firing continuously, all supplied with thousands of rounds of ammunition. German doctrine called for careful fire discipline to conserve ammunition. American doctrine called for overwhelming volumes of fire to suppress the enemy and maintain initiative. When these two philosophies collided, American material superiority proved decisive. Urban combat revealed another dimension of .50 caliber effectiveness. As American forces fought through French towns and German cities, the .50 caliber proved invaluable for suppressing enemy positions and buildings and for destroying fortified structures. The massive projectile could penetrate multiple walls of typical European construction. Masonry that would stop rifle fire and machine gun fire offered little protection against .50 caliber rounds. American tank commanders quickly learned to use their turret-mounted .50 calibers to suppress upper-story windows and rooftop positions. Before moving through urban areas, the technique was simple but devastatingly effective. A tank would halt at a street corner and the commander would traverse the .50 caliber across building facades, firing continuously at any potential position. The sustained fire would force German defenders to take cover, allowing infantry to advance. The tank would then move forward and repeat the process at the next intersection. German panzer teams, which were highly effective in open terrain and particularly dangerous in urban environments where they could engage armor at close range, found themselves unable to function effectively against American combined arms tactics that integrated .50 caliber suppressive fire. A Panzerfaust operator needed to expose himself to aim and fire his weapon. American doctrine called for continuous .50 caliber fire on any suspected position. The combination made successful Panzerfaust attacks rare in situations where American forces employed proper combined arms coordination. German company commanders who fought American forces in the Rhineland during the final months of the war described the impossibility of effective defense in urban terrain against American tactics in their post-war accounts. German infantry would position in upper-story rooms with good fields of fire. American tanks would approach and destroy the buildings with .50 caliber fire and tank main guns. The .50 caliber rounds would penetrate walls and ceilings. There was no safe place. Soldiers would take cover behind furniture or interior walls, and the bullets would find them anyway. The only way to survive was to abandon positions before the Americans concentrated fire on them. But abandoning positions meant losing ground, and there was no ground left to lose. The psychological impact of fighting in urban terrain against an enemy with unlimited .50 caliber ammunition was profound. German soldiers understood intellectually that walls and buildings provided concealment but not cover against .50 caliber fire. Emotionally, the human need to seek shelter behind solid objects was overwhelming. Watching .50 caliber rounds punch through meter-thick stone walls and continue through multiple rooms destroyed the psychological comfort that shelter normally provided. Soldiers felt exposed even when hidden, vulnerable even when protected by what would normally be adequate cover. This psychological erosion was cumulative. A soldier might survive one engagement, then another, but each time watching .50 caliber fire destroy what should have been safe cover. Eventually, the accumulated stress of knowing that no position was truly safe, that the Americans could and would destroy any defensive position with sustained fire, broke combat effectiveness. Units would abandon positions without being directly assaulted because they knew American firepower would eventually make those positions untenable. The final campaigns in Germany demonstrated the complete superiority of American firepower doctrine. German forces fought with courage and skill, often achieving local tactical successes against numerically superior American forces. But tactical success meant nothing when American forces could simply mass firepower and reduce German positions to rubble. The .50 caliber machine gun was the foundation of this firepower. It was present in sufficient quantities to engage any target. It was reliable enough to fire continuously for hours. It was supplied with sufficient ammunition that American commanders never needed to ration fire. And it was employed according to doctrine that valued suppression and destruction over conservation and precision. German tank crews learned to fear the .50 caliber for different reasons. While the M2 could not penetrate the frontal armor of German medium and heavy tanks, it could damage optical equipment, disable external stowage, and suppress accompanying infantry. More importantly, the .50 caliber could penetrate the thinner side and rear armor of many German armored vehicles at combat ranges. American M10 tank destroyers carried a .50 caliber anti-HB machine gun mounted on the rear of the turret for anti-aircraft defense and close infantry protection. Statistical analysis of ammunition expenditure shows that M10s fired far more high-explosive shells than armor-piercing rounds, indicating extensive use in infantry support roles, where the .50 caliber proved critical for what crews called cleanup operations in close quarters. A German panzer team might disable an American tank, only to be cut down by .50 caliber fire from accompanying tank destroyers or infantry support vehicles before they could escape. Night combat introduced yet another terror associated with the .50 caliber. American ammunition used a ratio of 1 tracer round to every 4 bull rounds. This meant that every 5th .50 caliber bullet visible to the enemy was a glowing tracer that marked the trajectory of the burst. German soldiers watching American .50 caliber fire at night could see the traces arcing toward them. Streaks of light that seemed to move slowly enough to track visually, but that arrived with devastating speed and force. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers could see death approaching. They could watch the tracers converge on their position. They knew that for every tracer they saw, 4 additional rounds were flying along the same path. The human instinct to duck or dodge was useless because by the time a soldier saw the tracer, the rounds had already arrived. Veterans learned not to watch the tracers, but new replacements would fixate on them, mesmerized by the deadly light show, often freezing in the open until the fire found them. American forces exploited this psychological effect deliberately. Reconnaissance by fire at night meant sending streams of tracer-laden .50 caliber fire across suspected positions. The visual effect was overwhelming. Entire sectors would light up with intersecting streams of tracers. The noise of the firing combined with the visual impact created an environment that German soldiers described as hellish. German infantry squad leaders captured near Aachen in October 1940 described the experience in their interrogations. At night, you can see them shooting even when they cannot see you. They fire at sounds, at movement, at nothing. The traces show you where death is coming from and you cannot escape it. You watch the streams of fire and know that behind every tracer are 4 more bullets. You calculate that one gun firing for 10 seconds sends 50 rounds toward you and only 10 are tracers. You see 10 streaks of light and know 40 more rounds are in the air. Then you realize there are not 1 but 5 or 10 guns firing. The mathematics of it are terrifying. You cannot survive that volume of fire by skill or courage. You survive by luck alone. The Germans had their own tracer ammunition, but their doctrine of fire discipline meant tracers were used sparingly. A German machine gun crew might fire a burst with tracers to verify their aiming point, then switch to ball ammunition to conserve the more expensive tracer rounds. American crews fired mixed belts continuously. The visual effect of American firepower at night was therefore vastly more impressive than the German equivalent. Even when German weapons had higher rates of fire, this visual dominance had practical effects beyond intimidation. American commanders could observe their own fire and adjust it in real time. If tracers were falling short of a target, the gunner could see this and correct immediately. German return fire was harder to observe because they fired fewer tracers. American units therefore had better real-time feedback on the effectiveness of their fire, allowing them to adjust and concentrate fire more effectively than German forces could manage with their more conservative use of tracer ammunition. The Germans tried to develop countermeasures. They attempted to use armor more aggressively to close with American positions before the .50 caliber fire became overwhelming. This rarely worked because American artillery and air support would engage German armor at longer ranges, forcing the Germans to fight at exactly the distances where .50 caliber fire was most effective. They tried infiltration tactics, moving at night and in bad weather when American observation was limited. But American logistics meant that .50 caliber ammunition was always available, and American doctrine encouraged firing at any suspected position regardless of weather. Targets were confirmed. The collapse of German doctrine, July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, began with 3,300 tons of bombs dropped by 1,800 heavy bombers on German positions near Saint-Lay. Generalmajor Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite German formations defending the sector. After the war, Bayerlein wrote extensive manuscripts for the United States Army Historical Division analyzing the campaign. His assessment of American firepower was clinical and devastating. He wrote that by the time his division retreated from the Est-El sector, it had been decimated not primarily by bombing or artillery, though those were significant factors, but by the cumulative effect of constant small arms fire that prevented his forces from maneuvering effectively. American .50 caliber machine guns mounted on every vehicle meant that his troops could not move to respond to American advances without being engaged immediately. His conclusion was that Americans had solved the fundamental problem of modern warfare. They had found a way to project superior firepower without requiring superior training or tactics. Bayerlein, promoted to Generalleutnant on July 20, 1944, participated in the bitter Battle of the Bulge and finally surrendered in April 1945. His post-war writings would become major sources for understanding German perspectives on American combat methods. He noted repeatedly that the .50 caliber machine gun, operated by soldiers with minimal specialized training and supplied with vast quantities of ammunition, created a baseline of firepower that German forces could not match with their more sophisticated weapons and better trained crews. The winter of 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West. German forces achieved complete tactical surprise and initial success. For the first few days, it appeared possible that German armor might break through to the Meuse River and split the Allied armies. Then American logistics reasserted itself, and with it the .50 caliber machine gun. American units rushed to the Ardennes, carried their standard load of ammunition and equipment. This meant that even ad hoc defensive positions could bring devastating volumes of .50 caliber fire to bear on German attacks. The battle devolved into exactly the kind of grinding attrition fight that favored American material superiority. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces used their .50 caliber machine guns to devastating effect against German infantry attacks. The guns operated reliably despite temperatures well below freezing, mud, snow, and the general chaos of sustained combat. German forces made one critical error in their planning for the Bulge offensive. They assumed that bad weather would ground American air power and reduce the effectiveness of American fire superiority. They were half right. Weather did initially limit air operations, but German planners had not accounted for the fact that ground-mounted .50 caliber machine guns were unaffected by weather and that American logistics could sustain ammunition expenditure at rates the Germans found incomprehensible. General der Fallschirmtruppen Alfred Schlemm commanded the 1st Parachute Army from November 1944 to March 1945 when he was wounded during Operation Veritable. The Canadian First Army's assault across the Rhine, Schlemm had the unenviable task of defending against Allied offensives with increasingly limited resources and declining troop quality. His post-war analysis, like Baud's, focused on the cumulative psychological impact of American firepower. Schlemm noted that by early 1945, German soldiers had learned to recognize the sound of American .50 caliber fire at great distances. The knowledge that any position could be engaged by these weapons, that any movement could draw immediate fire, and that German forces had no effective counter, created what he called a defensive mentality that made offensive operations nearly impossible. His forces successfully evacuated across the Rhine before the final Allied push, but he attributed his casualties primarily to the constant attrition caused by American heavy machine gun fire during the retreat, the technical triumph of simplicity. Technical specifications of the M2 Browning help explain its effectiveness. The weapon weighed 84 pounds without a tripod, 128 pounds with the M3 tripod mount. This made it heavy, but not impossibly so for a crew-served weapon. The effective range of 1,830 meters meant it could engage targets well beyond the range of German rifles and light machine guns. The rate of fire between 450 and 575 rounds per minute was slower than the German MG-42. But faster fire rates meant nothing when German crews had limited ammunition, the .50 caliber. Browning machine gun cartridge fired by the M2 carried specifications that made it effective against a wide range of targets. The standard M33 ball round achieved a muzzle velocity of 2,910 feet per second. Armor-piercing variants could penetrate 19 millimeters of armor at 500 meters, the M8 API. Armor-piercing incendiary round penetrated 16 millimeters at 500 and would ignite fuel or ammunition upon penetration. The M20 API variant with its tracer element penetrated 21 millimeters at the same range. This meant that while the .50 caliber could not defeat the frontal armor of a Tiger or Panther tank, it could penetrate the armor of half-tracks, armored cars, and the side and rear armor of many German armored vehicles. More importantly, it could destroy truck engines, puncture fuel tanks, disable artillery pieces, and suppress infantry at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The M2's reliability stemmed from its design. John Browning had begun development in July 1917 during the First World War. The M192-1 water-cooled .50 caliber machine gun weighing 121 pounds with its water jacket entered service but proved too heavy for mobile warfare. The M2-air-cooled version, adopted in 1933, eliminated the water cooling system and reduced weight while maintaining reliability. The basic operating principles of the weapon were simple, robust, and proven. American manufacturers, including AC spark plug, Frigidaire, guide lamp, and Colt, produced nearly 2 million .50 caliber machine guns of all models during the war years. Production of the M2HB, the heavy barrel version that could sustain longer periods of fire, reached approximately 350,000 units total across all services and theaters. This scale of production meant that American forces never lacked for replacement weapons or spare parts. The Germans understood intellectually what they faced. Their own weapons were in many respects more sophisticated. The MG-34 and MG-42 were better suited to the role of squad automatic weapon. The German 13mm MG-131 aircraft machine gun had a higher rate of fire at 900 rounds per minute. German 20mm and 30mm aircraft cannons were more destructive per hit than any machine gun, but sophistication meant nothing in the face of overwhelming material superiority. The Americans had built a weapon that was good enough for every role it needed to fill and had produced it in quantities that allowed universal employment. Every American bomber carried 13 M2S. Every fighter like the P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 M2S. Every American combat vehicle carried at least 1. American infantry companies had organic .50 caliber heavy machine gun sections, American anti-aircraft units could repurpose their M16 quad mounts for ground combat. The weapon was everywhere, always available, always supplied with ample ammunition, and it worked every time it was needed. The final reckoning psychological impact on German forces was cumulative and devastating. Individual soldiers might survive encounters with .50 caliber fire. Units might successfully complete tactical missions despite American firepower superiority. But over weeks and months of combat, the constant knowledge that the Americans could bring overwhelming fire to bear on any target at any time with weapons that functioned reliably in all conditions wore down German combat effectiveness as surely as casualties and equipment losses. This was not cowardice on the part of German soldiers. These were veteran troops who had fought across Europe and North Africa. Many had faced Soviet attacks on the Eastern Front, but there was something uniquely demoralizing about the American approach to warfare. The Soviets might mass human waves and artillery. The British might demonstrate tactical excellence and coordination. The Americans simply deployed overwhelming material resources and fired until resistance collapsed. German officers found it increasingly difficult to motivate men to attack when they knew American .50 caliber fire would meet any advance. German infantry became reluctant to maneuver in daylight. German vehicles clustered in cover rather than advancing. The tactical initiative shifted permanently to the Americans, not because of superior tactics or better training, but because American doctrine, built on unlimited ammunition and reliable weapons, made German doctrine obsolete. The hatred German soldiers expressed for the .50 caliber was the resentment of craftsmen facing mass production, of skilled warriors facing industrial warfare. The .50 caliber represented everything about American warfare that the Germans found alien. The casual expenditure of ammunition, the reliance on material superiority rather than superior skill, the willingness to destroy rather than to capture or bypass. These were not the methods of soldiers in the traditional European sense. These were the methods of an industrial power that had calculated that material expenditure was cheaper than casualties and more effective than tactical elegance. After the war, German military historians and former officers provided consistent assessments. The American .50 caliber machine gun was not the most sophisticated weapon of World War II. It was not the fastest firing, or the most accurate, or the lightest, or the most versatile. It was simply the most effective because it combined reliability, ubiquity, and overwhelming logistical support. The weapon itself was only part of the equation. The system that produced it by the millions supplied it with billions of rounds of ammunition and employed it according to doctrine that accepted material expenditure as the price of victory. That system was what defeated Germany. The legacy of the M2 Browning can be measured in its continued service. 80 years after it entered production, the weapon remains in active use with the United States military and armed forces around the world. It has long since outlasted every weapon system that opposed it in World War II. This longevity reflects the fundamental soundness of the design and the effectiveness of the American military philosophy it embodies. The broader strategic implications became clear only in retrospect. German military planning had assumed that superior training and tactical excellence could offset American numerical advantages. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The .50 caliber machine gun demonstrated that adequate weapons produced in overwhelming quantities and supplied without restriction trumped sophisticated weapons produced in limited numbers and supplied sparingly. The lesson was universal and unforgiving. In industrial warfare, the side that can sustain higher material expenditure will prevail regardless of tactical skill disparities. The Germans had brought a craftsman's approach to a mass production war. They had conserved ammunition when their opponents could afford to expend it freely. What German soldiers learned through bitter experience was that modern industrial warfare rewards not tactical brilliance or superior training, but the capacity to sustain overwhelming material expenditure. The M2 Browning .50 caliber machine gun became the symbol and instrument of that lesson. When those two approaches to warfare collided, the outcome was never truly in doubt.